From WAMU 88.5 at American University in Washington, welcome to the Kojo Nnamdi Show, connecting your neighborhood with the world. I'm Jen Gulbeck from the University of Maryland, sitting in for Kojo. Imagine that you're traveling in a foreign country when you're stopped by police, handcuffed and placed in a jail cell. You don't speak the language, you don't know why you're behind bars, and you aren't given a translator. For a homeless man arrested at National Airport recently, that nightmare scenario resulted in a 6-week detention at an Arlington jail. Except this man was deaf. His case has shown a spotlight on the rights and responsibilities of both the deaf and the hearing communities during vital encounters, whether it's with police or doctors in an emergency room. From Virginia to Washington state, legal cases around the country have shown that access to qualified sign language interpreters can have life or death repercussions. But too often, misunderstandings and even discrimination can adversely impact outcomes for this community. So what work is being done to foster better understanding for both the deaf and hearing communities in these situations? Joining me to discuss are Caroline Jackson. She's a staff attorney for the National Association of the Deaf Law and Advocacy Center. Caroline, it's good to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Also, Stephen Collins, assistant professor in the Department of Interpretation at Gallaudet University. He's a certified deaf interpreter. And interpreting for Stephen Collins will be Adam Bartley, an interpreter at the Gallaudet Interpreting Service. Stephen and Adam, it's good to have you both here.
Thank you.
And you can also tell that we'll have Stephen answering questions. He'll be signing and Adam will be interpreting. So there will be some pauses between my questions and the answers that you hear. But you can see a live stream of this broadcast at kojoshow.org, where we're also providing live captioning. So you can see what's going on in addition to listening on the air. You can also join the conversation. Do you have a disability? Has that ever resulted in a misunderstanding with law enforcement? You can reach us at 1-800-433-8850. Caroline, let's start with you. The story earlier this month that a deaf Ethiopian man was held in an Arlington jail for 6 weeks without an interpreter is pretty shocking. You're on a team representing the man, Ibrahim Zemedega. I'm going to try it again. I practiced a lot of times. Zemedegegeyu. Is that close?
We've gone with Zemedegegehu.
Zemedegegehu.
So very close.
Okay. Can you tell us why he was held and what he alleges happened to him during his jailing?
Yes, he was arrested on suspicion of stealing an iPad that belonged to another person. And it's important to understand that the iPad was actually found while he was still being detained. So it's reasonable that he was not involved in that. So he was arrested and he immediately began asking for an interpreter because he doesn't read or write English very well at all. They simply declined his requests. So he did not even know why he had been arrested. He got to jail, he was held, he had no idea what was going to happen next, when he was going to be fed, whether. And there are a number of incidents that arose while he was still behind bars. There are medical evaluations that occur, and he was unable to tell them that he had a back injury that required medication. And they actually forcibly performed some kind of test on him. We think it might have been a tuberculosis test, but he didn't sign the consent form because he couldn't understand it, and they simply held him down and injected him. And then there are numerous other incidents that are related to the lack of accessibility when he was behind bars.
A spokesman for the Arlington Sheriff's Office declined to comment to the press on the specific allegations. She said that the jail employs a number of deputies trained in American Sign Language and has other interpreters on call. She said, the quote, Arlington County Sheriff Office is committed to treating all persons in our custody with dignity and respect. But we don't obviously have any of them here to comment on the show today. Caroline, can you tell us more about the language barrier that police encountered with your client? Could he write English very well? You said maybe not. Was he proficient in ASL, American Sign Language?
So he does know American Sign Language. He made that a strong priority upon moving to this country to learn the language that he needed to use. And he also took classes at Gallaudet University to try to learn English, but it only got him so far. He knows how to write clearly enough that it is undisputable that he requested an interpreter. He can write that phrase. But it's also quite apparent in writing back and forth with him that he has a very limited vocabulary and his command of English grammar is not what it could be. So it can be quite difficult for anybody reading what he's writing to understand the message behind his words. And so it would be relatively apparent to anybody writing with him that he was not able to communicate that way.
By law, what should happen when police encounter and decide to arrest someone with a disability like this, someone who's deaf?
So for deafness specifically, they're required to provide the auxiliary aids and services that are necessary to ensure effective communication. So for him in this instance, it would be an American Sign Language interpreter. For other kinds of disabilities, they have other obligations, but it does the obligation overall needs to ensure that the person with the disability is being treated just as they would be, or with the same effects just as they would be if they didn't have that disability.
And you mentioned that the iPad that he was accused of stealing was actually found, though it turns out he was released from prison 2 weeks ago after he accepted a deal and pled guilty to a misdemeanor of receiving stolen property. And the public defender tried to reopen the case when the iPad was found, but he couldn't get the case dismissed after that point.
Yeah, exactly. So it was 6 weeks of detention for nothing.
You can also join the conversation. What special challenges have you observed for members of the deaf community in our public spaces and public services? Give us a call at 1-800-433-8850, or you can email us at kojo@wamu.org. Stephen, can you clarify the difference between American Sign Language and English? I think many listeners might think that they're the same thing.
Yes, certainly. American Sign Language is, first of all, a visual language, whereas English is spoken, and the grammatical rules and structures and cultural components to each of them are very different. Sign language is articulated manually, also in conjunction with facial expression, giving grammatical markers, meaning during its utterances. Vocal intonation in spoken English may change emphasis, just as emphasis and grammatical structures can be represented in sign language using the body, the hands, articulation, and the face.
The dual language barrier police encountered with Mr. Zemeda Gageyu was particularly challenging because he was deaf and his first language was Ethiopian Sign Language. Is this when international sign language could come into play?
Well, since this person did know American Sign Language, though not as a first language, as a second or third language, I would say this is comparable to somebody who comes with another spoken language from a different country here to America and has some passing proficiency in the spoken English here. I would say that that's a similar case. So he has some exposure to English in some settings, and American Sign Language. International sign systems are not languages, but they are conglomerations of signs from multiple countries brought together to use in a cross-national setting. And so it doesn't have all of the same components as the full written language would in English or ASL. In ASL, I believe, was this gentleman's third or fourth language of use. And so he did have the ability to use American Sign Language to some extent. In his particular case, he would need an interpreter with a second interpreter, certified deaf interpreter, who could mediate those language barriers.
Are there internationally accepted signs that most deaf people understand?
No, they're not. International use of sign language varies by country. International sign systems are used more widely in Europe, where countries are but each other and are very nearby each other. Here, typically people use American Sign Language or written English, and the signed languages also have different grammatical structures. The American Sign Language has its own, which are distinct and different than European signed languages. Where countries abut each other, these signed systems are used. And when Americans travel internationally, they do use some international signs, but it's not a codified, unified system.
Stephen, it's also important to note the difference between a deaf interpreter, which may have been useful in the Arlington case we're talking about, and a sign language interpreter. You're a certified deaf interpreter. Can you explain the difference between the two?
Certainly, I am a certified deaf interpreter. And the difference between this and regular interpreters that you may have seen before is that we are both using sign language, but the hearing interpreters are typically accented as second language learners. They don't have the same native acquisition and experience of the language. And so someone like myself who is native is able to mediate language in much more fine-tuned ways. This is not to say that certified hearing interpreters are unable to do interpreting tasks, but if you were to bring, when the stakes are very high, you want to bring people with the most intimate knowledge of the language into play. So as a person who is deaf, who has used the language in a native manner, I am more able to quickly adapt in these experiences, in these kinds of environments, and mediate those differences.
Caroline, unfortunately, the case in Arlington isn't as uncommon as we'd like it to be. There have been similar cases from Washington State to Louisiana that have similar storylines. Could you tell us about a couple of those cases?
Certainly. We have actually recently sued a parish in the Western District of Louisiana for holding a deaf gentleman in that case for 12 weeks with the same lack of access to interpreters or any way to place an outgoing call. And in his particular situation, there was a bond hearing done by telephone that he didn't even know happened.
Wow.
We have another situation of a deaf gentleman in Cleveland, Ohio, who was held for 3 months, again, with no access to a telephone and no interpreter to explain why he was there, or just, the rules of this, of what goes on in a jail setting.
Perhaps more common are cases where deaf individuals are forcefully detained, tasered, or even beaten because police misunderstandings arise from the gestures that they make while they're signing. It's a frightening situation and high stress for both the police and the deaf person, and that can lead to some unpleasant interactions.
Most certainly. I should have printed out the list that I brought with me, but we collected a dozen cases in just the past couple years and limited only to cases that made newspapers about deaf and hard of hearing individuals who were beaten and sometimes murdered by the police simply because of the lack of communication.
Stephen, the gesturing involved in sign language can sometimes be misunderstood as aggressive or even threatening, as we just discussed, and that can result in some unfortunate consequences. How do you address these potential cultural misunderstandings about gesturing in the deaf community and in the hearing community?
One important thing is that both communities need greater training because many members of the community, of the deaf community, aren't aware that police maintain a zone around themselves where they can protect themselves. And so anybody entering into that zone could be seen as a potential threat. So within the deaf community, we would generally gesture to the person. And if we were going to get pen and paper, we would want deaf community members to make very slow movements that are clear and less likely to be misunderstood. But likewise, police need greater training so that when they encounter a person who is deaf or hard of hearing, that they know what those boundaries are, know what is typical in interactions with deaf people. I would say both communities need to take some effort, take some steps to prevent that from becoming something that looks aggressive.
Steve, please go ahead.
And I would add that the police officers also need training on how to identify when someone is deaf or hard of hearing so that they know to adjust their approach.
Stephen, I know you also work extensively with the deaf-blind community, which uses a tactile form of American Sign Language. I would imagine that the issues we're discussing become more challenging for this group of people, starting with the number of interpreters that are available.
Yes, this is true. Many of those who have grown up using sign language visually and later lost sight and have specialized needs in either close vision access or tactile access to the signed language. So if anybody was in any kind of a legal situation, then there needs to be a special sensitivity with regard to the need for tactile access to the information around them. And that should not be perceived as a threat, which will require that law enforcement have greater amounts and kinds of training in interacting with people that are deaf and blind, and their use of both American Sign Language and its tactile form. One of the missing components here is facial expression. Those grammatical structures are often embodied in different ways in tactile sign language, so that a specialized interpreter like myself can convey that information more explicitly to that deafblind person. One concern very often with American Sign Language and police interactions is that the deaf person recounting a story of somebody being angry will then be seen as the person who is angry rather than simply the person who's retelling of that witnessed event. So this is cause for concern, these kinds of areas of misunderstanding. So that's why I wish to see greater attention to training for police, deaf and hard of hearing members, deaf blind community members, and in many of these deaf blind communities, these people are still driving with some sight with only some limitations, but will later lose sight. So they may still not have peripheral vision, for example, and so they will use tactile sign language. And so I have seen an experience where police have misunderstood the contact between the deafblind person and myself if we were in a vehicle where we reached out to touch each other, and they thought that that was some kind of an assault or something of the sort, when actually it was simply reaching out for us to be able to communicate tactily.
We'll continue this conversation after a short break. If you'd like to join us, you can call 1-800-433-8850 or send us an email to kojo@wamu.org. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm Jen Gulbeck from the University of Maryland, sitting in for Kojo Nnamdi. We're talking with Caroline Jackson, Stephen Collins, who's interpreted by Adam Bartley, about the rights for the deaf during vital encounters. You can join the conversation too. Do you have thoughts about how we can better understand the culture of the deaf community? Give us a call at 1-800-433-8850. You can send us an email to kojo@wamu.org. or send us a tweet to @KojoShow. And just a note, we are live streaming a video of this broadcast at kojoshow.org, so you can see the signing that's happening in the studio. And we also have live captioning on the website. Stephen, access to effective communication is so vital in these high-stress situations. So many people might ask, what about the obligatory phone call from jail? Most jails have text telephone or TTY phones. What are the problems with this technology?
The dilemma here is that that requires written English. So another better kind of access would be using video interpreting or video connections directly signing. So you're not having to use your second or third language. And in addition to this, video phones are far more common than teletypewriters in these days. Now, and as I said before, American Sign Language is, first of all, a visual language. So forcing us to then use the teletypewriter TTY device, it leads to greater misunderstandings using a second and third language in a different form. So I would say that using video phones, using video interpreters as well, is a much better kind of access than trying to rely only on written text. And I can, we can also use these to connect directly with another signing person through the direct video phone to video phone connection or video relay service using an interpreter. And the important thing here is that there is real communication access in that respect. Using a teletypewriter, a TTY, pretty much outdated technology, this limits the kind of information flow that's possible in that moment.
All right, I'd like to bring in a caller now. We're going to talk to Talila. I believe this is Talila Lewis. Hi, Talila, you're on the air.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you for having me.
Sure, can you give us a little bit of background about your organization and the work you do?
Absolutely. So I founded the organization Helping Educate to Advance the Rights of the Deaf, also known as HEARD, about 4 years ago now. I've been working on deaf wrongful conviction cases since 2007, and my organization has been working on deaf wrongful conviction cases, ending abuse of deaf and deafblind and deaf disabled and hard of hearing prisoners in prisons across the nation. So we created the only national database of deaf prisoners. Right now what we're finding is that departments of corrections and even the Federal Bureau of Prisons are not tracking the location of deaf prisoners. They're also not, figuring out what communication access needs are required for these individuals, which then leads to a host of concerns, some of which have been discussed, some of which have not. But, even prior to arriving in prison, the goal is, of course, to end the pipeline into prison by ensuring that communication is effective with police officers and attorneys. And so we spearheaded a Know Your Deaf Rights campaign with the American Civil Liberties Union just last year, where we teamed up with Marley Matlin, the ACLU, to create video for deaf individuals who, might need to know what are their rights when dealing with police officers. And we've been reaching out to police departments across the nation to train them and ensure that they know what's going on in terms of deaf culture and communication. And then finally, we've been training attorneys across the nation and working with attorneys across the nation on litigation, either high impact or individual litigation on behalf of individuals who have been affected by the justice as a result of not receiving full access. So that's a little bit about us.
So I have some additional questions for Stephen Collins and Caroline Jackson. I'd like to keep you on the line, Talila, because I think you'll probably have some comments to add as we discuss these legal and access issues.
Sure.
So Stephen and Caroline, both, this question's for both of you, and we'll start with Caroline. Many public services like law enforcement and hospitals choose their own interpreters, and that can raise questions about the quality of those interpreters in these really high-stress situations. Are sign language interpreters generally specialized or even certified for doing legal work like what we're discussing?
There is a certification available particular to providing sign language interpreting in the legal setting. And so it is possible to get an interpreter with that specialized training. And it includes training not only what to do in a courtroom, but also how to negotiate those interactions with law enforcement. So yes, there is. Stephen.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I would say, in fact, there are interpreters who have specific training for certified deaf interpreters and specialist certificate legal holders who are in hearing interpreters as well. They have specialized training in these areas.
Stephen, Florida has the third largest population of people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Its Association for the Deaf is pushing for the state legislature to pass a bill that requires all American Sign Language interpreters to be licensed by a state board. Are we seeing a broader movement like this for licensing across the country?
Yes. Yes, in several locations. And I wouldn't say that's across the board, but there are a number that are considering licensure to protect the interpreters, to protect the consumers of the interpreting services, and having certification currently through the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. Some states are looking at additional requirements and rules governing interpreting. And so licensing is one of these things. And if we consider the vocations of nursing or lawyers, they have to pass the bar. There is a standard set. So if one is to move to Florida, move to anywhere, then you would have to take specific exams to that state in their licensure exam. So the same, I would say, is true of our world with interpreting. Caroline, would you add anything to that?
I would add that it is critically important to make sure that whatever interpreter provided is in fact qualified for the situation. And that's not just a matter of looking at the interpreter on paper, but looking at the interpreter in action. It's unfortunately quite possible that an interpreter who looks great on paper will not appropriately understand the person that is signing and does not sign in a manner that the deaf individual understands. And that can have grave consequences for that interaction, especially when you're talking about police interactions and hospital interactions where the accuracy of communication is paramount.
Stephen, did you want to add on to that?
Yes, I did want to tie into that comment, and that's the reason we have certified deaf interpreters who are specialists in assessing the language use of the consumer. And an interpreter who is quite qualified in some setting is not perfect for every setting. And certification is always a minimum. It is the minimum standard. And so if you have doctors, they have both their general certification, but their special areas of specialization. And this is true of both the certified deaf interpreters and the hearing interpreters who are working with these people in these really life-changing kinds of moments in their lives. And the possibilities of miscommunication in them are just paramount. It's paramount that we have people that are qualified there.
And if I add just one more thought, usually the person who's in the best position to know whether the interpreter is qualified is the deaf individual. It can be very difficult for hearing people to actually assess the mistakes that are going on. So it's paramount for hospitals and police officers and anybody to listen when a deaf or hard of hearing person tries to indicate that the interpreter is not a good match.
So if a deaf person gets an interpreter that they're not satisfied with, should they ask for another one?
Most certainly, yes.
Did you want to add on, Stephen?
No, I was just agreeing. I think she covered it.
Talila, when you talk with lawyers and judges about accessibility problems, do you find that they're willing to spend the time and money to correct issues?
Can you hear me clearly here?
Yes.
Great. I find that on the whole, attorneys and justice professionals, so we're talking about law enforcement, do not understand deaf culture and communication. And when you take some time to actually explain deaf culture, deaf communication, communication access, it tends to be that they are willing to do the right thing, follow federal disability rights law that mandate equal communication access for all people. In the prison setting, however, it's a bit more complicated and it requires a bit more finesse. But it tends to be that attorneys in the courts want to do the right thing. They just have not known for a while that they've been doing it, not quite up to par.
We got an email from Mary Carroll that says, why don't all deaf people or other people with disabilities carry cards that have official government standing and that state the disability and define the rights to assistance in the proper way to respond effectively? Caroline, did you want to comment on that thought?
Sure. There aren't not such cards available in every state, but there are such cards available in some states. The problem is that they are not always heeded. So we do know of situations where a deaf individual has handed over a card stating that she is deaf and stating her rights, and the police officer threw it on the ground and stepped on it.
Wow.
Yeah.
And in fact, Not just that, but where that card should be put. Should it be put in one's pocket? Then when you're reaching for it, that's misinterpreted as reaching for potentially a weapon. So how do we then access that card to safely give it to law enforcement? That's why we would very often pull pen and paper out to write "I am deaf." And one of the first things we say in communication with the police officer, that could be seen as aggression towards the police officer. So how can we safely even convey that information to law enforcement?
We've just got about a minute left. So Caroline, can you tell us what's next in your work for Mr. Zemeda Gageyu, the man who was held in jail for 6 weeks?
What's next is to fight. The defendants are going to do everything they can to get out of it, and we need to make sure they're held accountable.
I really appreciate both of you joining us today. We've had Caroline Jackson, staff attorney for the National Association of the Deaf Law and Advocacy Center. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And Stephen Collins, assistant professor in the Department of Interpretation at Gallaudet University and a certified deaf interpreter. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks to Adam Bartley, who was interpreting for Stephen during our conversation today. I'm Jen Gulbeck, sitting in for Kojo Namdi. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back. Thanks for listening.